Blog Talk Radio.
C.O.W.S, Gus T Renegade, and Justice here for another program, hopefully to share constructive information that will help us replace racism with justice immediately. Very pleased for today's program. I feel like myself, I'm a black male. I feel like I've had a lot of experiences where I felt like police officers were perhaps practicing racism against me. I strongly suspected that they were practicing racism against me, and I know a lot of other non-white people, black people in particular, who feel like they've had a lot of experiences where police officers were just not treating them correctly. I think this is a pretty common theme amongst non-white people, amongst black people. It's in literature. You can go back, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, 70, 80 years ago. They're talking about the exact same thing and feeling like police officers just have a tendency, it seems, to mistreat non-white people, in particular black people. It has been a very rare thing for me to find a white person who's saying, yes, that's true. Police officers mistreat non-white people. Today's guest, not only this white person, former chief of police of the Seattle Police Department, wrote a book just, speaking honestly about his time as an enforcement official, what he participated in and what he observed. And he just speaks very honestly about the amount of racism that he observed as an enforcement official and the impact that had both on other enforcement officials and on non-white people who the police are charged with serving and protecting. I think for me, reading our guest's book, it was kind of like getting an opportunity to see what white people talk about when there are no non-white people around. That was pretty much the effect, and it was an incredibly impactful read to just hear a white person speaking honestly in this manner. Real treat to have him on the program today, and I hope you all will find what he has to say constructive. As I said, former chief of police of the Seattle Police Department. He also spent time as an enforcement official in the San Diego Police Department. Mr. Norm Stamper. Are you with us, Mr. Stamper?
I sure am, Gus. It's good to be with you.
Thank you, sir. Real pleasure to have you. If you could share with our listeners, just to give them an understanding of who you are and exactly why you wrote this book, Breaking Rank.
Well, I grew up in the city of National City, just south of San Diego. I became a police officer in San Diego in 1966 and served there for 28 years. And over the course of that career in San Diego, I underwent a major transformation myself. I had some early childhood experiences that left me not so much a fan of law enforcement. And yet when I became one at the age of 21, I quickly got sucked into the culture and began saying things and doing things that I'd never said or done before, and abusing the very citizens I'd been hired to serve. I laughed at things that at the time I thought were funny, and today I find shameful. And I engaged in behavior that can be charitably described as unprofessional. And then early in my career, I had an encounter with a prosecutor. This is a deputy prosecutor in the hallways of the San Diego County Courthouse, and I had suggested to him that he might want to dismiss a case that involved an arrest I had made. And he asked me why he'd want to do that, and I said, well, because it was kind of a skinny pinch. And he asked what I meant by that, and I said, well, the kid, he was 19 years old, wasn't really drunk, and he questioned me about that, and ultimately asked if the Constitution of the United States meant anything to me. So I was initially very angry at him, which of course was a mask of my own guilt and shame and embarrassment, because he had busted me. He had called me on the behavior that I've been exhibiting for the first 14 months or so of my career. Anyway, that's a kind of a long introduction to an awakening that I had in my early 20s that caused me to believe that racism, as well as sexism and homophobia and other brands of bigotry, were altogether too common in law enforcement. And so I set out as best I could to be a change agent and to work on improving the relationship between community and police by attacking the systemic problems of racism and discrimination, for example, within the institution of policing. So that by the time I was ready to leave San Diego and become Seattle's police chief, that was 1994, I had my views and values solidified and was very keen on helping to create a non-discriminatory environment in which police officers treated one another with dignity and respect, and needless to say, the community as well. Uneven results for the most part. I think we made strides. We made some substantial improvements, but racism is alive and well. I don't need to tell you this. In most, if not all, of our major institutions across the board. And of course, police officers are drawn from the community. And even if they don't bring to the work their own ignorance and prejudice and fears, those tend to get implanted by the police culture. So there's an awful lot of work that remains to be done.
Wow. I think folks listening in, I think this will be a very interesting program, just covering the material that you just laid out and getting more in depth with your book. As I said, I think a lot of non-white people that I'm around don't exactly think that the enforcement officials are the last people on earth who would be racist. Most of the non-white people that I know have had their share of just experiences that did not leave a good impression on them, that made them feel like they were probably experiencing racism when they had contact with enforcement officials. And to hear a white person speaking honestly about that, and not only that, but a white person who is former chief of police speaking honestly to this, extremely important. I do want to clarify, though, you are a white person. Is that correct, Mr. Stamper?
I am.
Okay. Groovy. This program, the C.O.W.S, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy, and the definition that I use for racism, white supremacy, is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you believe that such a system exists, and do you feel that definition is accurate?
You know, I would go back to some studies that I did fairly early in my career and that have been reinforced over the years, and that is that there are an awful lot of people, white people, who do not see themselves as racist. Will say to you, I wasn't raised by racist parents. I was raised to exhibit tolerance and understanding and appreciation even of differences. And yet I do believe very firmly that there are deeply embedded systemic features of discrimination that are in fact global. In my book, for example, I talk about the fears that I think young police officers particularly have if they're a product of a white experience and have grown up with white friends and perhaps had previous employment before they became police officers where that workplace was predominantly white. And then they find themselves assigned to a non-white community and experience a bit of culture shock and oftentimes fear that is bred of ignorance and misunderstanding. So I do believe that there are an awful lot of people who do not see the racism, and I think that has to do with entitlement. I think it has to do with a belief that without really thinking about it, without articulating it even to one's self, in this superiority, this dominance that you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, this is a real important show. I really got to be on my P's and Q's today, Mr. Stamper. I want to try and get as many questions as possible. So if you could, if we could be efficient with our questions, I'll be efficient in asking. If you could be efficient in answering without compromising, because you have a wealth of material that I want to try and get out to our listeners. So don't compromise your answers, but if you could make sure we get answers to the questions, that would be helpful.
I'll do my level best.
Okay. So do you believe that we are in a system of white supremacy worldwide, and do you believe the definition that I gave is accurate?
Do I believe it? Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Outstanding.
And I do think it's important to point out that there are various forms of discrimination. One of them is individual, where you're dealing with somebody who's just out and out a racist. Another is where the institution has grown up because of previous laws and policies and practices and creates this institutional level of racism. And the third and the deepest level, and the one that's most difficult to contend with, is structural. If in the past voting rights were denied non-white people, in the interest of efficiency, I'll just say that there are an awful lot of those vestiges of discrimination that are still embedded in our system.
I agree wholeheartedly. My co-host, she is a non-white female, and she is at the ripe age of 10. But she understands that we are in a system of racism, and she definitely wants to help us replace that with a system of justice as soon as possible. And she also has some questions that she would like to ask to help in that process. Justice, if you're there, go right ahead and ask your question.
Why do cops like to mistreat non-white people when non-white people sometimes don't do anything?
Well, one of the things that comes up for me in answering that question is power. Young people who become police officers oftentimes had no power in their lives. Now suddenly they've got a lot of power. And there's a tendency, I think, for people to be impulsive. There's a tendency to take pleasure in mistreating other people under the name or under the color of authority. So I think it's a variety of factors, but when that does happen, and it does not happen in every single case, but when it does happen, I look to the matter of maturity. You're 10 years old and you sound like you have an awful lot of maturity. You see the world as it is, and you sound like you're capable of making very good judgments. And too often we find police officers, particularly the younger ones, who are just starting out in their careers, who let the power go to their head.
And when you said prejudice, what do you mean by prejudice?
Prejudging, It literally does mean prejudging. If you look at the word if you look at the word of prejudice, the first part is something that happens before something else happens. So you're prejudging a situation. Let's say that you've got you're stopping two different drivers of cars, and one of them is non-white and the other is white. If you prejudge, typically as a white police officer, you're going to be treating that non-white person differently from the white person, and that is called prejudice. And of course, prejudice then becomes discrimination when you act on it. And in police work, we can't afford that. We can't afford to have prejudiced police officers.
Okay, that'll be all for now.
Okay, thank you, Justice.
Groovy. Again, real privilege and a pleasure to have Mr. Norm Stamper with us today. And it was, man, I thoroughly enjoyed reading Breaking Rank. I highly encourage all of our listeners. Hopefully, I won't even have to say anything. Hopefully, after today's program, you'll run out and find Breaking Rank and read it cover to cover. Mr. Stamper, one thing that really stayed with me throughout reading your book is that, excuse me, you are very forthright and very honest about things that you did that you seem to maybe even have some regrets about, and just speaking honestly about your participation. It's not like you just are pointing the finger at other people and saying, oh, it's them, I was great, I was innocent, I was the best officer ever. You are very open about talking about even things that you did, that you, as you already said, where you were not doing the correct thing. And some of that you talked about when you joined the force, when you worked as an enforcement official in San Diego. You said that choking out suspects, that was something that was enjoyable. And Justice, I hope she's covering her ears. You said that you would choke out a suspect and whisper in their ear, "You're gonna die, asshole." And it seems like what you already alluded to, this culture of being an enforcement officer. It seems like you talked about how that is bred into individuals when they join the police department. Could you talk about that and maybe why it was enjoyable to choke out a suspect?
I'd be happy to. And you're right. The kind of behavior that I describe in that book is shameful behavior, and I am ashamed of it. But it's important to understand, as you point out, why I felt that way and why I took pleasure in doing really bad things. And I think there are two factors. One is the person who comes to the work without offering a single excuse, but by way of explanation. I grew up in a family that was abusive. My father was physically violent toward his four sons. And as the oldest of the sons, I took the brunt of that. So there were a number of occasions when I was beaten and bloodied by the person in my life who was supposed to be the most respected, certainly male role authority figure. So it was a tough life. And as I grew up, I had decided I'm going to be as different from my father as I could possibly be. He had attempted to ingrain in me white supremacy and racism. I remember one occasion when I came home from school, I was bragging about, this was, I think, the 8th grade, might have been the 7th, I can't recall now, but a young black friend by the name of Ike Johnson had been elected our class president. And that was just so unusual. And I came home and I said, "You're not going to believe this." And I was proud of Ike, and I was full of my own sense of wonderment and awe that we had done something in our little school class that had made such a difference. And he proceeded to lecture me and talk about the superiority of whites and the inferiority of non-whites, challenging me, and he actually left me in tears. I knew he was wrong. I also knew he was my father, and so it was complicated. but I grew up saying to myself, I will not be that kind of person. Then I become a cop, and then the other part of this answer really does get to the question you raised, and that is the culture. That culture welcomed me. I felt like I was now part of a family. And these were personable and magnetic individuals, and they had what I considered at the time an incredible sense of humor, and they welcomed me. That became home. That became family. And I tried to emulate the people around me. I offer that, once again, not as an excuse, but just as an explanation. So for the first 14 months on the job, as you point out, as I said in my book, my favorite thing was to taunt somebody and get them to take a swing at me. Because if they did that, then I could use what was called in those days the standard carotid police sleeper hold. In other words, I could choke them out. And I would, in fact, whisper in their ears as they were losing consciousness, "You're going to die." How could a young person like myself grow up resolving never to use the N-word, always to be responsible, always to treat people respectfully, wind up behaving that way? It's the power of the culture. That culture's changed. It's shifted. It's improved. But as I pointed out earlier, that was 1966, but it's still got a long, long ways to go.
Wow. Again, Mr. Norm Stamper, author of Breaking Rank. I want to touch on one more thing before we hop into what because you spent a lot of time talking about racism and other issues of mistreatment, issues of mistreatment of females, particularly female enforcement officials, and other issues. But I really want to address and focus on the racism for this program. Sure. You talked about how this culture in the police department went so far as and you talk about your own experience in actually shooting and killing a suspect, where the culture at the police department was one where this was something to celebrate. You said you likened it to celebrating a game-winning touchdown, having killed and this was an unarmed suspect, but having killed someone, this was, hey, good job, Stamper, good shot, great job. And you talked about how that seemed incredibly incorrect and perverse. Could you speak about that as well?
Yeah, I sure could. The circumstances of that shooting were these. A mother had called in. This is an all-white cast, by the way. A mother had called in and said that her son had been stolen by his father. This couple was estranged, a 3-year-old son. And in fact, he had taken the child, had not returned him, was making threatening phone calls, was attempting to set up a meeting with her, which caused the whole family as well as police officers a lot of concern, because he had been described to us as quite violent. He had beaten her and the child on previous occasions, had hung his father-in-law in a closet upside down with baling wire. I mean, he was a very violent person. And he was supposed to have been armed with a .32 caliber pearl-handled revolver. So I was a lieutenant at the time, well beyond the years that you might expect a cop to be involved in a shooting. But I assembled a bunch of detectives in plain clothes and unmarked cars, and we started saturating the area where we thought he was. I did, in fact, spot him in the car, saw the little blonde-headed kid sitting next to him on the passenger side, and we followed him. And he pulled into a gas station, got out of the car. He didn't know we were right behind him, got out of the car and walked into the service bay of this gas station and picked up a phone, at which time I badged him. I took my badge out, identified myself, and he ran through the other side of the service bay and back out to his car, where he jumped in screaming he was going to kill the boy, and moved his hand in such a way that he was simulating a gun, and I shot him. I had told him to stop repeatedly. I had told him I would shoot him. At that time, as he was running from me, I would not have. but talk is cheap, and I thought if that works, that's great. It didn't, so I did shoot him, and he was in fact unarmed. When when I got back to the station and over the next few days, I did in fact hear the kinds of things that you're talking about, which was kind of a celebration of the shooting. Now, I've now talked to a number of officers who've been involved in fatal shootings, none of whom feel like celebrating. It's one of the worst things that can happen in your career. I received a commendation from the district attorney who said, in all likelihood, I saved this young boy's life. I appreciated the commendation, but I also knew that the man didn't have a gun. I was sure that he had it before I shot him, but to learn that he didn't made it even more difficult to really accept what the other officers were saying.
Again, Mr. Norm Stamper, going to see if Justice, you have some more questions you would like to ask Mr. Stamper.
How would I speak and act with a police officer when I am alone? That's
a really very good question, Justice. Johnny Cochran, now no longer with us, was of course an attorney in the Los Angeles area, and he represented clients in very high-profile cases. And we brought him to Seattle to talk with young people. He and I both had a conversation with young people in the Central District. And one of the things that he said was, if a police officer stops you, and this is whether you're alone or with friends, but if a police officer stops you, the best and smartest thing you can do is be polite and cooperative and do what the officer says. He said, and of course many of the kids were now thinking, wait a minute, what you're saying is it's okay for a police officer to mistreat you or abuse you and treat you without dignity and so on and so forth. And what Johnny Cochran was saying is, if that happens, get the badge number of the officer, get his or her name, get the car number, and call me, meaning call Johnny Cochran. And what he was saying is, you don't want to be, even if later you prevail and you win your argument, you don't want to go to jail. You don't want the police officer to engage in physical violence against you. So the best and smartest thing you can do is cooperate, but never ever allow a police officer to treat you disrespectfully without making a report of it and filing a complaint. And I think his advice was very, very sound. He was even saying such things as, let's assume that you've done absolutely nothing wrong, and a police officer orders you down on the ground and maybe handcuffs you. You still don't want to resist. Excuse me. That's my little dog adding his own 2 cents. Apologize for that.
No problem.
In any event, it's real important, I think, to understand that you have an opportunity after that interaction, after that contact, to make a complaint, and I always encourage people to do that. Many say, well, nothing will come of it, nothing will happen, but I can tell you during my time in both San Diego and Seattle, we worked very hard to encourage feedback about police behavior. If it was positive behavior, it's always nice to get praise. If it was not positive, it's important and necessary to get that critical feedback as well.
What do you do when a police officer is mistreating you?
Well, as I said, the best thing you can do, the smartest thing you can do, is to be polite and be respectful. That's even when a police officer is not being polite or respectful. In fact, it's even more important under those circumstances to do just what Johnny Cochran was saying, and then once again get the officer's badge number and name and the car number as well, and note down the date and the time and the place, and maybe even write a few words about the circumstances. What were you doing? What was the police officer doing? How did this whole thing start, and how did it end? And then pass along that information to the police department. Now, I believe in what's called civilian review, and Seattle has a form of civilian review now, but that's a whole other topic. But I think the important thing is to note the date and the time and the place and the circumstances.
Okie dokie. Excuse me. I wanted to, I thought this was super interesting. I hope everyone who is listening to the program perk up, particularly if you are a non-white person, perk up, listen closely, and think of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing if you've read her work. In Breaking Rank on page 92, you said that we say white officers treat black men the same way they treat white men, but that's a lie. In fact, the bigger, the darker the black man, the greater the fear. The African American community knows this. Most whites know this. Can you share about that statement, Mr. Stamper?
Sure. I think if you grow up white in this country or many other places around the world, you have this, as I mentioned, this sense of entitlement. You may not even be conscious of it, but it's there. This superiority, dominance thing that you were talking about earlier. And if you grow up unexposed to friends, to coworkers, to teachers, to other authority figures who are all, if you grow up without the influence of people whose skin is darker than you, who have other cultural differences from your sort of cultural anchors, there's this tendency, I think, to develop fear. I personally believe that what we don't know hurts us. I think that if we grow up ignorant, fear is a natural product of that. And I really do believe that the larger, the darker, the black man that a white police officer, an uninitiated, immature white police officer faces, that in fact is a recipe for major problems, if not disaster. Fear causes everyone, but let's just talk about police officers now. Fear causes police officers to act impulsively and do things that they might not otherwise do. So anything and everything we can do to reduce the fear, in the hearts and frankly in the minds of police officers as well, is something we want to encourage.
I found it very interesting because not only did you talk about how this fear was further enforced in the training that enforcement officials received. You said that they were given information about the Nation of Islam and told that these were black people who were trained in hand-to-hand combat and hated white people and wanted to commit violence against white people, and that this was then generalized to all black people feel this way about white people.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, sir.
No, please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, I was just going to add that you went on to say that you had these fears of black people, and it seemed from the story that you shared about what happened at your school and electing this non-white kid to office, that you did grow up around black people, but you somehow still ended up being fearful of black people.
Well, I didn't really. See, that was one of the things that made Ike Johnson's election so special. And I don't doubt that there were many kids who voted for him because of his personality. He was just a wonderful kid, and everybody loved him, and he was fun to be around, and so there was a certain novelty because he was I remember one other black kid at my school. I'm thinking now about middle school, or what we used to call junior high school. And there was a kid named Sammy Jordan and a kid named Ike Johnson, and the fact that I could name all the black kids in my class is a pretty good indication that I didn't grow up with black people. So what happens is you get this white experience, which is unmediated by the presence of people who are different from you in one form, one fashion, or another. So, and in fact, in the police academy, that generalization that you're talking about was reinforced with what we called C stories. Police instructors telling stories about a big fight that they had or a shootout that had gone down somewhere, earlier in their careers and on a beat. And more often than not, these stories had their focus in the black community. So even without being explicit about it at all, what was happening is, all these stories about these dangerous situations, people fighting the police, people shooting at the police, police officers engaged in one form of violence or another, seem to be situated in the non-white communities. And that's a not so subtle reinforcement of the fear, that I think does cause people to act belligerently or impulsively and do things that in some cases they know, in most cases they know are wrong or is wrong.
Wow, I really want to hammer this home. As I said, for me as a non-white person, this was just incredible reading your book, and I really want to try and share as much information with our listeners as possible. You shared a lot of incidents that kind of help illustrate how this ends up playing out in terms of mistreatment when you go from just being in a system of white supremacy and being conditioned to being white, from joining the police department and going through the academy and getting these stories about crazy fights with black people and the Nation of Islam, how this ends up being translated when you actually get out, you're on the beat doing your work. Can you share the incident that happened in San Diego, the Bucket of Blood Club, and what happened with your senior officer there?
Sure. I was still what's called a recruit. And in those days, you spent the first couple of weeks in a classroom, long days. At the end of those 2 weeks, you spent half your day in the classroom and half your day in the field. Now, we didn't call them field training officers in those days. They weren't particularly carefully selected in those days. They were just cops working a beat. And I remember working with one veteran police officer in southeast San Diego, in a neighborhood called Logan Heights, and it was around the intersection of 30th and Imperial, and he pulled up to a very famous or infamous bar called the Bucket of Blood. That was its nickname. I couldn't tell you what its real name was, Black and Tan or some such thing, but there were a number of little taverns and bars in this area. And this one had become known to the police officers as the Bucket of Blood. It got that name because there were a lot of stabbings among patrons. There were fights out in the alley behind the bar, fights spilled into the street, and so forth. So it had a reputation, a well-earned reputation as kind of a bloody bar. Well, this officer pulled up in front and gave me directions. His directions basically were get out of the car, go into the Bucket of Blood, and come out with, and I will not use the language that I did use in the book simply because justice might be listening and others as well. But he gave me some explicit instructions to pick out the biggest and the meanest of the patrons in that bar at that time and arrest him and bring him out. Now, going through my mind is arrest him for what? But you know, I was a rookie and I was being sucked into this culture, and you know, and I thought, well, if this is what I have to do to get along, then I'm going to do it. And then he said, and I will quote this, and he said, "Don't forget your nigger knocker," which was the baton that police officers carried in those days. I was shocked by the language, even though I had heard plenty of racial and ethnic slurs by that stage of my career. This is just a one-on-one situation, and here this guy is telling me to go in and essentially make a false arrest and bring a man out who, frankly, would have been arrested solely on the basis of his skin color. So it was a very impressionable moment. I didn't like it. I hated it. And then, of course, as I'm walking to the front door of the bucket of blood, he yells back at me, "Come on back here." So what he had done was set me up. This was to see whether I had what it takes to be a cop, whether I had the nerve to go into this notorious bar and arrest somebody. It was really a disgusting thing for him to do, needless to say. But it wasn't all that uncommon. In those days particularly, you were testing your recruits to see whether or not they had the right stuff.
Norm Stamper, author of Breaking Rank. You talked about your time in San Diego, that you worked on an investigation to try to clean up some of this, to work against some of this racism that you were seeing. It seems like was rampant in the department. And I just wanted to reveal some of the information that you shared from this investigation that you conducted. And this was in the 1970s. You said that 30 of the 31 officers reported using racial slurs, and I wanted to read these slurs to the listeners because
Sure.
I'd never heard of some of these. I don't even know what some of them mean. You said for black people, the racial slurs were niggers, boys, splibs. I don't know what that is. SPLIBS. Never heard that one before. Toads, coons, garboons. Never heard that one before. Don't know what that is. Groids, Sambos, buckwheats, Rastas, Remuses, Jigaboos, Jungle Bunnies, and Spooks. For Latinos, it was greasers, wets, wetbacks, beans, beaners, bean bandits, spicks, and taquinos. Again, quite a few of those. Never heard, don't know what that means for quite a few of those. And if you have any info on a few of the ones that I named that I didn't know, don't know what those mean, that would be great too. And you went on to say that it seemed like the mean indicated that over 90% of the officers at this time were using this type of language in the way that they talked about black people, non-white people.
Right.
It went on to say that maybe 50% of some officers' arrests of black people were unjust, and that perhaps 20% of the black people that were arrested, they were called attitude arrests, in quote, where I guess they said something smart to the officer and got handcuffed, taken away. 15 to 20% were bum arrests. I guess that would be just a totally incorrect arrest where they really hadn't done anything. Can you talk about some of the statistics and some of what you saw during your investigation?
Sure. Now, this was 1976-77.
Okay.
Actually, in the spring of 76, 3 probationary police officers, these were people who didn't have their first year in yet, all resigned. All of them resigned voluntarily. All 3 of them had worked in Southeast San Diego, which is predominantly, it's a series of communities, actually, of people of color. And each of these 3 officers, on their way out in an exit interview, alleged that there were patterns of discrimination and racism, excessive force, a slower or a more apathetic response to crime, for example, in the black community. So you had, 3 young police officers. One went to the Secret Service, one went to the San Diego County Marshal's office, and I remember the third who decided that police work wasn't for him and went back to work with a Coca-Cola bottling company. So I remember these 3 guys. I knew all 3 of them fairly well. And I was most impressed to learn that instead of just round filing or tossing those exit interviews, the captain, who was in charge of personnel at the time, brought them to the attention of the chief. I happened to be a captain, and in those days, captains went around the clock. So I was the graveyard captain, and I had 31 officers working just my shift in Southeast San Diego, a lieutenant and 3 sergeants and 27 police officers. Now, as I mentioned, and of course, as you noted in the book, 30 of the 31 cops who worked for me, and I had made my expectations quite clear, that non-discrimination was and dignified and respectful treatment of people were all non-negotiable. They were conditions of employment, and if you couldn't meet those conditions, you should find a job somewhere else. So I'm their captain, and literally under my nose, these 30 officers, all but 1 sergeant, said, yeah, I use racial or ethnic slurs. Most of them said, well, I really don't do it in public, or if I do it in public, it's to defuse a situation, as if the use of that kind of language could diffuse anything. And it was shocking to me. I was utterly surprised, number one, by the language and the imagination that they had trumped up to come up with these names, because just as you expressed surprise, so was I, so were my fellow captains who were doing interviews on the other 2 watches, and all with similar results. So it was clearly shocking language. Now, I was also surprised that they told me, and I did everything I could to encourage them. I said, look, this is a study. This is not an internal affairs investigation. We want to examine our practices, and frankly, unless anybody is confessing to a crime, we're not likely to take punitive disciplinary action. We wanted a moment in time to really capture the extent to which racism in a big city police department was prevalent, and we sure found out. So all those terms that you heard were individuals saying, when I would ask them a question, I would ask them, do you personally use racial or ethnic slurs? If the answer was yes, then I would say, talk to me. Tell me what terms. And they would, many of them, be reticent to do that. They didn't feel comfortable. And I said, I want to know what the terms are. And so they laid it out. And the other 2 captains, as I was saying, who are doing this thing simultaneously on their watch, days and swing shift, were finding the same results. We also learned that officers were using excessive force, that they were in fact responding to crime in those communities in a slower, more apathetic way. In other words, these were communities that weren't getting the full protection of the law and the services of their own police department. When they have a car broken into, or somebody hot prowls their home or engages in other criminal behavior, the police were responding more slowly to these. So it was at least surprising, if not shocking, the results of this investigation.
Wow.
And that's late 70s. I mean, people say, well, that's ancient history, and my response to that is, no, it isn't. That is not ancient history. That's yesterday in the life of an institution.
Wow.
Now,
again, I'm sorry.
I would just mention this, Gus. Once again, working in a black community, of the 31 officers, only 1 was black. Only 1 was non-white. And what does that tell us? We have this fundamental obligation to make the police department, delicate public agency, representative of the communities they serve. So obviously that became one of the major recommendations out of this investigation.
Wow. You actually share an incredibly poignant anecdote of that one black officer. I want to get to that in a second as well.
Sure.
But you also, excuse me, you also talked about how this, the racial slurs and kind of contempt for non-white people, the slow responses when non-white people reported incidents of crime or needed police assistance, how this spilled over into the use of excessive force when they dealt with non-white suspects, black suspects. You said that 71% of the officers admitted the use of excessive force. One enforcement official, he reported that 25% of the officers regularly used excessive force, and that most officers confessed to minor instances, and you have minor in quotes in your book, minor instances of excessive force. This could be anything from handcuffing someone too tight on purpose to Dr. Welsing moment number 2, kneeing a non-white suspect in the groin, and you even said that you engaged in some of this behavior.
Are you still there, Gus? Hello?
My apologies. We've had this problem consistently where phones have been dropped. I suspect it could be interference. I'm going to pick right back up where I left off. You said, Mr. Stanford, that you had even engaged in some of this behavior yourself in what you alluded to earlier in kind of goading a suspect into retaliating so that you could then use force and arrest them. And you, make sure I'm getting the correct one, you also... the choking suspect out who needed it, and you have that in quotes, choking someone out who needed it. Could you respond to some of the information you revealed about the use of excessive force?
Well, yeah, and of course it's important to recognize that excessive force is not just beating somebody. Mm-hmm. It does include applying those handcuffs too tightly, which can cut off the blood and create major medical problems for an individual. It frankly includes putting somebody in the back seat of a police car without protecting their head. A person can wind up with a deep gash if they with their hands cuffed behind their backs and in an awkward position, try to get in the car without the protection of a police officer. That's why you'll see, for example, on television a lot of the times police officers doing just that. In any event, and it can range up through and including, an out-and-out beating. But I think what I was hearing, of course, was that this was behavior that I believed, that the kind of behavior that I engaged in during my rookie year, that I believe had been more or less extinguished. And that was the real shock to me, and it was a defining moment in my career. This recognition that the top of the organization, the brass, can say this is what we stand for and believe in, and this is what we expect, only to find that at the operational level, where the rubber hits the road, the behavior has not changed. So we set about in that police department to really change our internal accountability, so that we number one, sent the strongest possible message about the kind of behavior that would be tolerated and not tolerated, and then followed up on it and acted on it.
Wow. I want to see if Justice has more questions, but I did want to point out, because you noted this in your book, that this investigation was diluted quite a bit before it was released publicly, that they didn't, the media did not really release everything that you all uncovered in your investigation. They watered it down significantly. Still was not a glowing report, but they didn't nearly get all of the information that you all uncovered in your investigation.
That's right.
Justice, do you have some questions you would like to ask Mr. Stamper?
What do you do to stop a police officer when he or she is practicing racism, white supremacy?
Well, you start with picking the right people in the first place, doing everything you can to satisfy yourself that the people you're hiring, the people you are making police officers, know the difference between right and wrong and behave accordingly. In other words, they know the difference between what's the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do, and then they act on that. They in fact behave professionally. And then you provide good training to them, and you make sure that you have people from the community participate in that training, and you attempt to develop what some call cultural competence. That goes by a variety of names like diversity training and so forth. But the key here is making sure that police officers understand that they're going to be doing police work in a community of very different individuals and cultures and groups and values and the like. Then you make sure that they pass all of that they understand what is expected of them. And then you make it clear that if they can't or won't refrain from racism or discrimination, you fire them. And there's no substitute for that. You have to make sure that you take out of uniform a police officer who discriminates. That's the right thing to do, and it also sends a message to the other officers.
Okay, that'll be all for now.
Thank you.
Groovy. I also want to thank Mr. Stamper for calling in. We were both disconnected momentarily, which has happened frequently on these programs. I don't know if that's something you all have observed in other programs on this network, but not the first time that's happened. I wanted to also touch some of the different, I'll call them codes, that you observed in terms of how white enforcement officials would speak about racism, white supremacy on the job. And the one that caught my attention that was most profound, long before driving while black was in vogue, and long before the use of the phrase racial profiling. This is apparently, I guess, during the 70s when you were with the San Diego Police Department. You said that the term was busy being a nigger. Mm-hmm. Was this a common phrase that was used by white police officers to just talk about their feelings about non-white people, black people in particular?
Well, I can't say that it was common. What I can say is that it came out in that same context that we were discussing earlier as part of this Southeast investigation. One of my officers, when I asked him about racial and ethnic slurs, did in fact use that phrase. First time I had heard it, and frankly the last time I had heard it. But it did, as you pointed out, it did predate driving while black, walking while black, so on and so forth. And this officer, tragically, got a kick out of it. He thought it was a very funny and very witty thing to say. And he wasn't claiming, by the way, that he had said it. He said that he had heard it, and looked at me and said, "You have to admit that's pretty funny." And my response to that is, no, it isn't. It's not the least bit funny. And so, there was this mentality of acceptance in those days that just made it all that much easier for individuals who might be on the fence. How important is it for you to get along with your fellow officers? How important is it for you to stand up for what you believe in? That by creating this atmosphere of acceptance, it makes it way too easy for people to just go along.
Wow. I wanted to get some of the other phrases out because it was incredible to read this. And again, having this come from a white person, former chief of police, sharing this information was it was stunning. Some of the other codes, one was no humans involved. When police officers, I guess when they would talk on their radio to alert someone of a crime or something that's happened, no humans involved, to let them know that black people are involved in this, so you should adjust your concern and maybe downgrade this as a priority since there are no humans involved, it's just black people. The other was 1113. I'll let you explain that one. And a misdemeanor murder. If you could explain those two for our listeners, that would be
fantastic. This is the culture of the day using terminology. Now, I need to clarify, this wasn't going out on the radio.
Okay.
This was going car to car, police officers talking to one another face to face, person to person. If anybody had dared say something like that over the air, much as they did, by the way, after the Rodney King incident and after the O.J. Simpson trial, when police officers in Los Angeles were engaged in car-to-car radio traffic. So there was a record of it, of what they were saying, gorillas in the mist and these kinds of, ugly statements. But in those days, back in the 70s, police officers would use 1113, which is the radio code for an injured animal. In other words, a dog has been hit by a car, for example. The call would come out as an 1113. And police officers would use that term followed by the racial slur. 1113 cat, 1113 dog, 1113 nigger. I certainly did hear that during my rookie year in conversations with police officers. No humans involved, just what it means. I mean, you talk about the dehumanization of non-white people. That term meant just that. No humans involved. Or misdemeanor murder. A murder is a murder. That's a felony always. And yet to put the adjective misdemeanor in front of it was sort of cop talk for exactly what you were talking about. And that is to minimize the significance or the importance of it. It's some of the ugliest language you can imagine in police work, in and of itself, to be sure, but also because it sort of belies an attitude about what police are here to do. Saying no humans are involved, talking about a misdemeanor murder, it is one of the worst possible things that a police officer could say, because it means the people in that community are not going to get the kind of service that they're paying their taxes for and that they're entitled to. I will also point out, Gus, that those terms generally have also been used to describe prostitutes. No humans involved. A prostitute, for example, who has been murdered, a sex industry worker, who has been assaulted. The officers might, in fact, talk to one another and use that kind of language. It's a very convenient way of basically saying that some people are more important than others, and it represents the ugliest, I think, of the culture at its worst moments.
Wow. That I also want to point that out too, because you do spend a significant amount of your time, as I said, speaking about this same sort of disrespect that is shown towards female enforcement officers, fellow female police officers, and prostitutes. You spend a good deal of time talking about that as well in the book, Breaking Rank. I said I wanted to get back to the one black officer in San Diego, because you shared just an incredible story when you spoke with him about racial slurs, and I think that's really important if you could share that with our listeners.
Well, this officer was very well respected among his peers. As I said, he was the only non-white police officer working in a predominantly non-white community. And I asked him all the questions, of course, that I asked all the other officers. And when I got to the issue of racial and ethnic slurs, I said, "Do you personally use racial or ethnic slurs?" He hesitated for a long moment and said yes. And I pressed him, just as I did the white officers, and, all right, give me the examples. And he offered up a few, and I could see he was already becoming quite emotional. I said, "Why do you do this?" And his answer essentially was, I go along to get along. And by this point, tears were streaming down his cheeks. He felt, I think, saturated in shame for having betrayed his own values and other members of his own community. And it was one of those most painful moments. But I suspect for him it was a turning point as well. In fact, I know that it was, just based on his behavior after this investigation. He had reclaimed some pride and some dignity as a human being.
Wow. When I read that story, and again, just kind of putting everything together, the picture that you're painting of your experiences, and seems likely this is probably representative of what happened, and I suspect continues to happen at some level at a lot of enforcement agencies across the country. You have a ton, it seems, of white enforcement officials who are either saying racist things or conducting themselves in a manner that would suggest this person is probably racist. That this is happening on a grand scale, has happened on a grand scale, and that this even comes out in slow responses to non-white citizens who are requesting help from the people who've been charged to protect and serve. This also is manifested even in how white officers treat non-white officers. You even talked about how white officers would be slow to respond, to give assistance and backup if a non-white officer called in for assistance in making an arrest.
Well, I think I just clarify one thing very quickly.
Yes, sir.
That would be a non-white officer who had stood up for himself. Or his community. If you're a non-white police officer and you've made this choice to go along, to get along within the culture, you're probably going to get even better service. So, from your fellow officers. But those who stand up for themselves and for their communities, more likely than not, would have at least the impulse on the part of fellow officers not to give them the kind of backup and cover they need to get their jobs done safely.
Wow. That's, painting a pretty sad picture here for non-white people. And if this is the police department, if this is the type of conduct and firsthand accounts from the police department, that lets me know a lot about what I should expect from other businesses, other areas of people activity that are not charged with being the best of the best and serving and protecting and upholding law and order. That lets me know a lot about what I should expect across the board if this is the conduct that I'm seeing from enforcement officials.
Well, and I think that's a very good observation, and I'm not going to let either of us get off without talking about cops who are not this way.
Oh, for sure.
It's just extremely important to understand that much progress has been made since, what we're talking about was revealed officially within the San Diego Police Department back in the 70s. Great progress has been made in that department. I was part of that progress, and I'm proud of it, and I'm not going to, exhibit any false modesty. We fired people who used racial and ethnic slurs. We really reinforced the training and the discipline and the performance evaluations and the reward system and recruitment and selection. Everything was gone over with a fine-tooth comb, and we really made dramatic improvements. In no way do I believe there are institutions in policing and education and in corporate America, for example, have been cleansed of racism or discrimination against non-white people. But I think two things have happened. One is you've got new generations of police leadership, people who grow up having been told at the beginning, you behave this way, you're fired. Find employment elsewhere. And so they grow up in a system, and they get greater exposure, both in the academy and in non-enforcement situations. There's something, if we get time to talk about, I'd like to maybe share an observation about one of the things we did in San Diego that carried over into Seattle. So progress has been made, is what I want to say. And there have always been, even in those days, there are police officers, for whatever motives, white police officers, who absolutely refuse to tolerate the kind of behavior that we're talking about. I remember one in particular. It was a lieutenant, and we were having, what commonly was called a riot. We were having lots of riots in San Diego in the mid-'60s when I became a cop. And we had campus unrest, we had anti-war demonstrations, and we also had in the African-American community, we had a lot of what some today would describe as insurrections, people standing up against the patterned abuse of their police officers. So there would be lots and lots of rock and bottle throwing incidents, occasional shots fired, people being handcuffed and carted off to jail and so forth as part of these demonstrations, and there would be cars torched, and a lot of that image that we have from that era of incredible tension between the police and the community, and how that plays out. There was one lieutenant who I know because I knew him fairly well before and got to know him much better later as I got promoted up through the ranks. I was a patrolman at the time. Who said, I'm telling you right now, if I hear the N-word from any of you, I mean, this was, this was back during the days of a wink and a poke. People used that language, and it was not only tolerated, it was kind of implicitly at least encouraged. But this was a guy who absolutely, in his heart of hearts, believed that it was fundamentally wrong, and he wouldn't do it, and he wouldn't tolerate anybody else doing it. So all along there had been those people sprinkled throughout the culture who have, I would call them tiny principalities of power. These are people who exercise sovereignty over who they are, and if they hold to particular values, they're going to hold to them, and they're not going to let the broader culture cause them to engage in misdeeds and so forth. And they do it for the right reasons. So they've been around, and in the past, they've clearly been the exception. The trick is to make it the rule, where you get, for example, two white police officers, and one uses a racial or ethnic slur, and the other cop says, knock that off. I don't appreciate it. Officer A looks around and says, well, there aren't any of them around. And the white officer says, doesn't matter. I'm offended. And when we get to that point, we will have arrived.
Again, Norm Stamper, Breaking Rank. Justice, do you have some questions you would like to ask Mr. Stamper? Uh-oh. Justice, are you there? Oh.
Why do police officers mistreat non-white people?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Justice?
Why do police officers mistreat non-white people?
I'm sorry, I'm missing the middle part of that. Why do police officers what?
Mistreat non-white people.
I think it has to do with their lack of self, their lack of maturity. They're not comfortable with themselves, and they fear other people, and perhaps resent other people, and they wind up behaving badly when they do mistreat people. They're really showing who they really are, and they shouldn't be police officers. And they shouldn't be bank loan officers, and they shouldn't be bagging your groceries at the store. I mean, they cause a lot of harm. So I think it's a lack of maturity. They're not as grown up as you are, for example. And many of them, unfortunately, grow up learning certain messages about differences, and they see differences as deficits. They see people who are different from them as less than them, and so that leads to mistreatment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's all.
Okie dokie. I want to see if we can sneak a few calls in as well. We'll get in two questions before that. And my first question will also be a response to your earlier comments about the improvement, even though you have easily conceded that we certainly have a long way to go. My response would be that I think racism, white supremacy, can inflict some of its most intense damage when you do not have white people making explicit racist comments. When you don't have white people who are saying nigger this or misdemeanor murders, gorillas in the mist, you don't have any white person with a smoking gun, that's a racist. But you end up with things like what you talk about in your book, the Rockefeller laws, where no one has called anyone a nigger, but you end up with hordes of black people jammed into prisons where you said this looks like another example of how racism, white supremacy works to abuse non-white people. And I think that is still rampant across the country. You even talked about how in Texas they have a higher rate of locking up black people in Texas than anywhere else in the country by far. Another example of where you don't necessarily have any white people standing and jumping up and down talking about we've got 1113, a nigger, don't even worry about it. But you do end up with a severe racist effect where large numbers of black people are being harmed by what seems to be the system of racism, white supremacy in action again. Would you agree?
I would agree enthusiastically. I couldn't agree more. I think what's happened now is that you don't get the blatant and obvious stuff as much. Mm-hmm. What you get is much more insidious. And in that sense, because you can't see it, taste it, smell it for what it really is, it gets excused, it gets explained away. Well, the reason more non-whites are in prison is because they're committing more crimes. Well, let's take a look at those, quote, crimes that they're committing. More often than not, they are nonviolent drug offenses. More often than not, they are victims of the war on drugs in wildly disproportionate numbers. In fact, Gus, this is something a number of people don't really understand about the war on drugs. When Richard Nixon was preparing to trot out his new policy, proclaiming drugs public enemy number one and declaring all-out war on them, he was really declaring war on his own people. To my way of thinking, what he did on that occasion was especially if one looks back at all the damage that has been done, was an impeachable offense. And in fact, he and Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, his two top aides, were in the Oval Office talking about the following. Well, we really can't say we're targeting young black men So we're going to have to, quote, target their recreation, and made a fundamental assumption about drug use. White drug use, by the way, is comparable, if not greater, than non-white drug use in our society, and yet to the order of 6 times to 12 times the number of young black men, for example, are going to prison behind nonviolent drug offenses. And those Rockefeller laws, of course, have been draconian now for decades. But Nixon, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman specifically targeted young people, poor people, and people of color as the victims of the war on drugs. We spent $1 trillion prosecuting that war, incarcerated tens of millions of people, wildly disproportionate numbers of them young and poor and of color. And what do we have to show for it, by the way? I mean, I know that's a whole other topic, but the drug war has done far more damage than good, and it's time to end it and to empty those cells of particularly young black men who have been separated from their families and sent to prison for a long time, and have found their lives damaged, if not destroyed. They're not likely to find employment very easily or satisfying employment. They're not likely to be able to, if you get busted for a nonviolent drug offense, you can lose your school loans, you can lose your public housing. It's just a horrible, horrible thing that we've done. And yet you pointed out Texas. During the 1990s, Texas built 1 university and 77 prisons. And people point to that with pride. It's a matter of shame and an embarrassment to our country.
Wow.
Don't get me started.
Again, Mr. Norm Stamper, breaking rank. Last one before we go to the phone lines. And again, this is beyond just the police department. Just one stat I wanted to share from the book really quick. You indicated that in a 5-year period, the Los Angeles Police Department, 350 cases were sent to the district attorney alleging police misconduct. 27 were prosecuted. 350 cases over a 5-year period. 27 are prosecuted. This isn't the police department. Now we're talking about the district attorneys and what they choose to prosecute, what they choose to ignore. Sure. This is a problem, a systemic problem, racism, white supremacy, not just saying the police are bad, everybody else is cool. A lot of other people are responsible for why this is. Before I go to, and this is a tough one, I'll save this for last. We're both, Mr. Stamper and I, we're both in Seattle. Just this week, there was a white enforcement official who was killed in the line of duty. Mr. Stamper talks a lot about enforcement officials and the danger that they face on the job, and even shares some specific stories about enforcement officials who were killed. The one in his story, Mr. Tom Riggs, he was killed in the line of duty. And racism popped up even in that story. In the footnote, he talked about where the suspect in question in this case, the black male, I believe it was, witnesses alleged that one of the enforcement officials called him racial slurs and assaulted him before this individual fired back and ultimately killed an enforcement official and wounded another enforcement officer. I have concluded, since we are in a system of white supremacy, that as long as that is the case, even if a enforcement official is killed by a non-white person, whether it's what happened with Mr. Tom Riggs, which should not happen, which is incorrect, what happened with the enforcement official who was killed here in Seattle this week, as long as the system of white supremacy exists, the white people who practice and maintain that system are most to blame, even when these enforcement officials are killed by a non-white person. Do you think that is a true statement?
It varies from case to case. What does not vary, however, is that if we set up a tension between the community and the police, particularly communities that historically have been most oppressed and most neglected by their law enforcement agencies, then the outcomes of some of these conflicts between police and community are not just hard feelings or bruised egos or people who feel they weren't treated respectfully. The outcome can often be death, sudden violent death. It could be a citizen, it could be a police officer. We all, I think, have a stake in creating equality, true systemic equality, so that if nothing else, we remove that issue from the picture altogether. The Sagan Penn incident's the one you're talking about. Tom Riggs, I knew quite well. I knew his father. I worked with him at the police academy. And Tom Riggs didn't do a thing wrong. But the officer who survived this shooting incident is alleged to have used racial and ethnic slurs. He's the one who had his gun taken away from him by Mr. Penn. It was his bullets that killed his fellow officer. And I think there is, that's a very dramatic case. And I think, we all have an obligation, but it's fundamentally the duty of the police to behave professionally and respectfully all the time, so that we can, as I say, at least remove this ultimate and tragic outcome from the picture altogether.
I want to get 253. She called in. She wanted to ask a question. 253, do you have a question for Mr. Stamper? 253, are you there?
Hello?
Yes, we got you. 253, do you have a question for Mr. Stamper?
Yes, I do. In Chapter 11, titled Sexual Predators in Uniform,
yes.
On page 122, you tell a story about an officer who strangled a 20-year-old San Diego State University student for resisting sexual advances. He then throws her off a 70-foot bridge. What would you suggest to females who have been ordered or requested sexual favors from officers?
Well, let's start with a couple of facts. One of them was that was, in fact, a police officer. It was a California Highway Patrol officer who strangled Kara Knott and, as you point out, threw her body off the bridge. This was a police officer who had developed a pattern of stopping young women. Sometimes he would cite them, sometimes he would warn them, sometimes he would make no record of it at all, but most often he was engaged in this pattern of hitting on women. She resisted him and wound up being physically attacked by him and murdered. He's still in prison. That's where he belongs for the rest of his life. The best advice that I can give is if you have any doubts at all, and this gets complicated, but if you have any doubts at all that the person following you, number one, is a real police officer. Sometimes it happens that people are impersonating police officers to this very end. Drive to a well-lighted area. If you happen to be in the vicinity of any kind of a police facility, drive into that. Drive into a gas station parking lot, a place that is well lit where there are witnesses. The vast majority of contacts do not result in police officers putting the make on women or on men. We have women and police officers. We have gay and lesbian police officers. Sexual misconduct in uniform is abhorrent. And the best advice that I can give is to recognize your rights, assert yourself. Say, for example, if you got a police officer saying that he wants a sexual favor, say no, and say it very clearly. But the best advice is to get to a lighted area where there are witnesses around.
Conduct, and that the cities would have been better off if they perished. And you gave examples of Rodney King being compensated, Abner Louima, and some others. You also said that to keep to keep the mouths of the department shut and to help keep costs down was part of being in the police department. And I'm wondering, how can you say that you went through a transformation and want to improve the system when 30 years later you continue to assist in the exploitation, mistreatment, and misconduct of others as a captain, lieutenant, and a chief?
Well, I'm sorry, but I missed the whole first part of your question. I think I can piece it together from what you said. You have a choice, I think, if you fancy yourself, experience yourself as a change agent. You can either change the system from inside or outside. I elected to do my work inside, and I have a bias. I believe very strongly that people within the system are best poised to actually make change, the kind of fundamental systemic change that's necessary. Earlier, Gus was talking about district attorneys not filing charges against police officers. If you're on the outside looking in, there's very little you can do about that. If you're on the inside looking out, one of the things you can do is walk across the street or drive across town and sit down with a prosecutor and say, look, I need your help. I want to send a message to the community and to my police department that this kind of criminal misconduct on the part of police officers is simply not going to be accepted. So I don't rationalize it at all. I just believe very strongly that as I got promoted up through the ranks, I was in a position to help affect the kind of changes that I wanted to see.
Would that help be being quiet and not making reports about police misconduct to save the city money?
No. In fact, I hope you understood that what I was doing there was engaging in some cynicism. In other words, there is no question, but if Rodney King had been killed at the hands of those Los Angeles police officers, the settlement of that case would have been for far fewer dollars. So I'm being purposely cynical about that. And what I'm saying is whether it's the Abner Louima torturing case in the New York Police Department or the Amadou Diallo wrongful death shootings of that young man, or the Rodney King incident, that it's really important to understand that if a death is the outcome, the individual or his estate is likely to receive less money in a settlement. This business about keeping one's mouth shut, I have openly acknowledged that there are occasions when I have felt very strongly that what I needed to do was to reach out to the survivor, for example, of someone that may have lost his or her life at the hands of the police and apologize. And yet you will have the attorneys saying, don't do that. Now, I found ways to do it most of the time. But you work for the city, you work for a municipal corporation that has in-house counsel, and their job is to cut exposure and cut losses. And I think I understand that. I understand that impulse. They're working to save the taxpayers' money. But it's important in the interest of accountability that where we were wrong as a police department, we pay the price.
Mr. Stamper is about to sign off from us. The last question I wanted to get in before he gets out of here, I wanted to ask actually one of our listeners. She's all the way in Austria. She's listening to the program, and she wanted to know why you wrote this book, revealing so much information about racism that you experienced and participated in. Why did you write this book, and why were you so honest in this book?
Well, I have felt this book was in me for a long time. I believe very strongly that the worst thing we can do when an institution is plagued by racism and other isms and other ills is to keep our mouths shut about it. So my belief is that exposure is healing. It also gives you the extent to which a whole lot of additional work needs to be done. So it was to both reflect on progress that's been made, but also to point out what I consider to be the major systemic ills of the institution and the culture, so that they in fact can be changed. And the most gratifying feedback that I've had has come from police officers who at the time the book came out were captains or lieutenants, for example, and who've become police chiefs in other cities. And they're saying that they're using my book as kind of a blueprint, and that's obviously music to my ears.
Wow. Again, Mr. Norm Stamper, Breaking Rank, it has been a real privilege to have you on the program. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I hope everybody, if you're listening to this program, you'll make an effort to go out and get his book and read it. I think it has a lot of just real important information to check out. Thank you a ton for taking some time out of your morning to come and talk with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Gus. I've enjoyed it. I appreciate it very much.
Been a privilege. Again, Mr. Norm Stamper, author of Breaking Rank. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can get you back on the program at a later date.
I would look forward to it.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick commercial break, and I see we still have, that's Kim on the line. If you would like to share some thoughts on the program, we're going to take a quick commercial break, and I'll come right back and get your thoughts. If you think Mr. Stamper had anything constructive to share with us, we will be right back.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open-source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
Context of White Supremacy, Gus T Renegade, and Justice. Kim, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, though. Groovy. Yeah, Mr. Stamper, he said he could do 90 minutes, and a little bummed, but I think we got as much as we could have in 90 minutes. I wish he could have stayed longer so we could have got more questions. What did you think about what he shared on the program? You actually have read the book, so you can share either from what you've read or what you heard on the program.
I just found that in the book there was a lot of conflicting information, and then just even on the show he was talking about trying to improve the system and working within. And, he says it's hard to see from the outside, but just his accounts of working within, he says a lot of things that really just contradicts what I think would be replacing white supremacy with justice. Just some examples are that he talked about in the book when he would go out, when a particular night when he went out with his superior officers for what was called a night of chair humping. And he witnessed his superior officer engaging in so-called chair humping with a female. 3 songs later, he zips up his pants and pays her $60. Sounds like prostitution or, other things to me, but, it's I think that, he very well contributed in the exploitation and mistreatment of others, and his conduct, we have to look at that first. He can say that he's trying to improve the system, but when he talks about after his so-called transformation, he's doing all of these things that doesn't look like he's trying to improve the system.
What specific things did you think he was doing after his alleged transformation that you felt were incorrect, or him continuing to participate in racism, white supremacy?
Well, I think that a lot of that activity does contribute to racism, white supremacy, rather, either indirectly or directly, such as, the prostitution and the money gained from that and everything, they govern that at the end of the day. And then when a police officer was killed, he talked about his thoughts about that he prayed that that person gave him a reason to blow him away, and that he's having these thoughts and of wanting to do injustice or wanting injustice done to people still after his so-called transformation. He also talked on page 133 about how he would lie and so-called, in quotes, create arrest reports, and that to me that's really contributing to racism, white supremacy, because it's putting more people in jail, and there's more black people and other non-whites in jail than the whites, and then so he's creating these reports about people who shouldn't be there.
Wow. I want to make sure I share this with everyone. When I bring white people on the program, I generally have two objectives. Number one, sharing constructive information. If it's a white person and they have specific information that I think would be helpful for non-white people to hear, I want them on the show. That was the case with Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly. That was the case with today's guest, Norm Stamper. That was the case with Dr. Nancy Krieger. That was the case with John Patash. If it's a white person and they have specific expertise in an area that I think would be helpful for non-whites, I want to get that information. Or if that white person is willing to talk about and speak honestly about the system of racism, white supremacy. So that would be like a Tim Wise, Jessica Pettit, Noel Ignatieff. I have a very different purpose when I bring those people here. But those people, I really want to make an effort to challenge the things that they're saying to see if it's accurate, if it's logical, and then to point out, that I don't really think these people are sincere about replacing white supremacy with justice. I really try and hit at that with the white people who say that they are actively doing so-called anti-racist work and really focusing on the system of white supremacy. People like Norm Stamper, I'm much more interested in getting his information that he has about what he has observed in terms of non-white people, the way that they practice racism, white supremacy in police departments, specifically San Diego and Seattle, where he was chief of police in Seattle. For the record, I don't think any of these white people are sincere about replacing white supremacy with justice. None of them, not even Dr. Martin Kevorkian, who I think is great, book is great, love to have him on the program for a third time, and I would tell him that if he comes on the program. I would have no problem telling him that, or any other white person. I don't think any of them can say that they're sincere about replacing white supremacy with justice, Norm Stamper either. But it's more about getting, for me anyway, it's more about getting information. But you, I think, raised a very good point about making sure that we don't get into, do you think non-white people would read his book and think, wow, this guy is great. He's sharing all this. He's changed. He's turned over a new leaf. Do you think non-white people would kind of read it and take that position on the book?
I would have to say no, just because of the conflicting information in the book. I mean, I think it's great that he's being maybe more honest than some people about the system and what actually goes on. I think that that's great. But overall, as a whole, I wouldn't say that, to view him as great or to, be thinking that he would be trying to replace white supremacy with justice, after reading his book.
951. I went to you a couple times and I couldn't hear anything. Are you there? I have you on the switchboard. Are you there?
I am here, sir. Greetings.
I can hear you now.
Great.
I'm sorry you were not able to get your question in to Mr. Stamper.
No problem at all. Not your fault.
What did you have a specific question or a comment that you wanted to make about the information? This is Back of the Bus for those listening.
Yes. I had a question. You brought up part of it regarding the enforcement official that was killed in the line of duty here in the past week in Seattle. I wanted to ask Mr. Stamper if he had any suggestions for any person that the police confront, put their spotlight on, and tell them to I mean, police, when they confront you, they tell you to put your hands up, for instance, take your jacket off, and so forth, so forth. To add some more context, 2 weeks ago, coming close to 3 weeks now, a 13-year-old was shot when police told him to told him what they tell any non-white person. He was shot when he took his cell phone out of his pocket. He had already taken his jacket off. He was taking his cell phone out of his pocket, and he was shot twice. And I've lived in this area where the non-white was shot, the 13-year-old, and also where the enforcement official was shot. And I spent some time around there, and I don't feel safe when the police are anywhere near there, but they're always there. Especially now after the enforcement official has been shot, there's a lot more police, a lot more sheriff's deputies. And I wanted to ask Mr. Stamper what to do in a situation when police are telling you to do things, but as the past has shown us, even when you do what's directed, they might just shoot you. But, yeah, he had to go outside.
I know this is something that I have focused on, and I think you have focused on as well. Do you have any suggestions about specific things? I think you had even talked about someone had tried to codify that if you have to take a wallet out or identification, how you should try to go about doing that in a codified manner to protect yourself if you're with an enforcement official?
Something I tend to do in situations like that is verbalize what you're going to do in the form of a question. So even if the enforcement official says, take your jacket off, be redundant and say, I'm going to take my jacket off, is that okay? There's no guarantee, but I think that may help the situation quite a bit. If you're going to reach in a pocket, say, I'm going to reach in, if it's your right pocket, my right pocket with my left hand, is that okay? And so forth, just to attempt to minimize any injury you might receive. But, yep.
I think that sounds excellent suggestion for non-white people, particularly black males, because he did say the darker you are, the greater the fear, greater the chance for hostilities. So I think especially for black males, that sounds like excellent advice. I think he said, and I would agree, be as courteous and respectful as possible, and really try to keep in mind you're dealing with people who have been trained to use lethal force. And as he said, and as it's in his book, a lot of these people look forward to the opportunity to choke someone out. He said that he used to look forward to the opportunity to choke someone out. He enjoyed that. And that the police department, it creates that type of culture where you'll have people who are looking forward. In his book, he says they would live for these moments to go out and get a suspect, round someone up, and perhaps have the opportunity to use physical force. So you should keep that in mind and really try to do everything you can to be courteous, respectful, and just keep things from escalating. That's really what you want to have in mind. And asking questions, as Back of the Bus shared. May I reach in my pocket? This specific pocket, right side, may I take my jacket off? Asking questions and moving slowly. I found that works very well too. Keep your hands visible, move very slowly, nothing quick, asking questions. Either of you, I guess, did you feel he had constructive information to share from what you heard on the program?
I did. I haven't read the book, and I haven't even had a chance to browse through the book. I'm going to make that happen, if possible, in the future. With what you and both Tim said earlier regarding this white person now comes forward and writes a book about this, I'm a bit suspect. He is white, one, and Mr. Bradley said they're not going to stop, and I've seen evidence of that myself. But he's no longer an enforcement official. It may be something different if he was an acting police chief of Seattle, and he came forward at, say, a news conference and said, well, this happened, and so forth. But I mean, now he's a bit older. He wrote a book. The white man, snitched a little bit, but I also suspect he knows a lot more information. But being non-white, there's not much we can do about that. I do think the program was constructive. Thank you, Gus and Justice, for hosting this program.
Kim, did you see? Because you've actually read the book. Did you see any contradictions, I guess, in what he shared on the program and what he's actually written in the book?
guess just the contradictions that, I don't think that he was really trying to improve the system. I just think that he was, I kind of heard a metaphor, kind of like, almost like the Matrix, he's trying to have his own system. It might not be necessarily the system that the police are doing, and, he might not agree with all of the mistreatment, but he's trying to have his own system to where, he's leading it, and then, he's kind of calling the shots as far as, what happens and just how to deal with the people underneath him. I guess one thing was earlier on in the book also, he said that my heart goes out to any man who has been falsely arrested. And he says that an injustice is an injustice. But then later in the book, there was a part about a black man getting shot and killed, and he was also unarmed. And he said that the officer who shot the unarmed black man and killed him should not have been punished. So he's calling it an injustice. Well, I mean, here it's talking about arrest, but, it's still, I believe it's still part of it. It's still taking action upon somebody who hasn't, done something, and, he's so-called saying he's trying to improve it, and he's saying this in his book, but then he also says that nothing should happen to the officers.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think our listener from Austria, I think she is on the line. I'm just going to check to see if she has anything to say. Oh, she's listening to the program. That's where we're getting the feedback. If you did want to say anything, Justice X, if you would like to chat, if you could turn your speaker volume down, and we could get your comment as well if you would like to say anything, sharing your thoughts all the way from Austria on what you heard. Yeah, I think he had interesting information, constructive information. I think the book is of value. But again, he's a white person. I don't believe any of these white people are really going to work to replace white supremacy with justice. I do think some of them have, or I think a lot of them have very constructive information that is of value to non-white people. And I do think you can get that, but I don't ever really get caught up in thinking, this person, wow, he's down for us, he's great. I think that's dangerous. That can lend you where you end up having more Tim Wises, these people that you look to as the proverbial God figure who've come to help out the non-white people and be nice to us, and they're practicing racism too. Don't want to do that. Don't want to make any more Tim Wises. Back of the Bus's blog, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com. Please make sure you check that out. Again, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com. I will check to see if Justice X, do you have any? She hasn't turned the volume down, so I assume she doesn't have a comment. Justice, did you have any comments on the program that you wanted to share?
No, I don't.
Okay. Do you want to share your email address?
Yes. justice.asap@yahoo.com.
Outstanding. Again, justice.asap@yahoo.com. We have 7 minutes left. Back of the Bus, or Kim, either of you, did you have any comments you wanted to get out before we wrap up the first program we have today, and the second program will be later in the afternoon with Professor Trask from the University of Hawaii?
Yes, sir. Mr. Stamper said after the review in San Diego, there had been a lot of, I think the term he used was progress, and I see the same parallel with the Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly program, in which Dr. O'Reilly said COINTELPRO is no longer functioning, and the FBI ceased activities that were conducted under the COINTELPRO label. I don't think, in my opinion, that there has been a revision in police departments. There have been a lot of examples of white people coming forth afterwards even. One example is Mike Rupert, a white male who works for the Los Angeles Police Department. He, in front of a number of black people in Watts, Los Angeles, confronted the then director of the CIA, also a white person, and said that he participated in distributing crack cocaine throughout Los Angeles with the CIA. And I think white people may have gotten a bit more codified and the 1113's nigger may have stopped a bit, but I do think they've gotten more effective at mistreating non-white and black people specifically. Just my opinion.
Kim?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, the constructive part, and I think that, I'd like to share it with other non-white, especially potentially black people, is just that, he did say that, the bigger, the blacker you are, the more fearful they are of you, and then so I think that they're more, susceptible to mistreatment, and I hope that, any of the non-white males, particularly black listening out there, that, just keep this in mind, that, they just really need to be, on their guard and just in all aspects, because, there's, Norm Stamper also said in this book that, it wasn't the last, probably wouldn't be the last Rodney King, not the last Abner Louima or Amalu Diallo. And then he also said that in his book that black defendants are not accorded the same due process as whites, and he said not now, not ever, not in this country. So, I would just say that it's constructive, and I would just say, if you know a non-white person or a black person, that, to really help support them to, just, support them and help them, because they're already going to get it from the white people and the police officers.
Outstanding. I would agree. I hope everyone caught that. He said, darker you are, more likely you will be mistreated. I hope everyone caught that. He also said in the book, I think Kim caught that. Do you remember the part where he said they would also mistreat non-white people if they were with a white woman? Do you remember that part?
I don't recall it this time.
Okay. It's in there. I'm not making it up. It's in there. I can get the exact page number if anybody wants to call me on it, but it is in there. He said that was another thing that would draw misconduct from police officers if they saw a white woman with a non-white male. And I believe Dr. O'Reilly even commented about Bill Cosby's son and what happened to him. And Dr. Weldon said that it was some people had alleged that he was with a white woman at the time that he was murdered. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. We have second program today. I forgot Professor Trask. She's a non-white female professor at the University of Hawaii. I found out about her online. She was mentioned in an article where white people were complaining about non-white people, Native Hawaiians, not liking them and being upset with them in Hawaii. And the article quoted her, and she was saying that the non-white people in Hawaii, Native Hawaiian people, have every right to be angry with white people. And she has written a book, notes from a Native daughter. She also has a film, and she just talks really honestly about how white people have practiced racism, white supremacy in Hawaii, how they've been mistreated, a lot of the same things that they've done worldwide, alcohol, Christianity. She goes into detail. I think it'll be cool to hear a very different perspective, someone with similar problem that I'm facing, white people not doing the correct thing, practicing white supremacy, but from Hawaii. Be real interesting to hear her perspective. She's pretty tough. She's pretty tough. She doesn't hold too many punches. She is clearly upset. She even got in some trouble. I think George Bush the First, when he was in office, he came to Hawaii to speak, and she let it be known that she was not pleased with his conduct, and she got in some trouble. Hopefully she can share information on what went down with that. But Professor Trask. I'm not saying her first name because I'm incompetent and I'll botch it. But hopefully she can say it, and I'll learn how to pronounce it correctly on the program. It will be at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Central, 4:30 p.m. Pacific later on today. I'm going to try one more time just to see if we can get Justice X in all the way from Austria. Volume's still a little high. If you could turn that down. Did you have a comment you wanted to get in before we go?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. If you could turn your, maybe mute the computer volume. You'll just have to,
Okay. You hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to listen to a cop. I mean, it was, what can I say? I don't believe, too, that white people are interested in replacing the system. Because if they would, they could in a minute, I guess, because they got the power to do it. So I'm just curious. I just want to know why are they? Why do some white people, talk so honest about it? This is what I'm curious about. Why are they doing that? I don't trust them in order to that they're interested in replacing the system. So what's the real reason? That's what I'm asking myself.
Very interesting question. I'll pitch it to the other folks on the line. Why do you think some of these white people come forward and speak, I guess, more honestly, I'll say, or give the appearance that they're speaking honestly about racism, white supremacy? Why do you think some of these white people are doing that?
My opinion, I'm in Seattle, and I've observed a lot of the white people here are very refined at practicing racism, and are kind of junior Tim Wises. Like, they'll speak honestly about the system to get non-white people to say, oh, they're cool. Just my opinion. Mr. Norm Stamper, I wouldn't be surprised if he treats his dog better than any non-white person. So, yeah.
Wow. The female, this is Justice X. She's all the way from Austria, listening to the program.
You like to say that, huh?
Say that again, please speak up, Justice X.
I said you like to say that I'm in Austria.
Oh yeah, that's important. That's important. The global system. Important to let people know we have non-white people, victims of racism, listening from all over the world, and dealing with mistreatment. You are a victim of white supremacy. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Do you have anything you would like to share about your experiences in Austria as a non-white female? If you could speak up for us, please.
What can I say? It's like at university nowadays, and it's like the class it's like my mind is getting so much information about racism. It's unbelievable. I'm planning to write a dictionary on their book and their words. It's like, wow, I didn't know that. I mean, I wrote you earlier. It's like the words you think as a non-white person, you grew up with words love and trust and all that, you know. Then find yourself as a mature, as an adult in this system, you'll find out that these words don't mean what you thought they mean. You know, it's just like, wow, seeing the world in a totally different color, you know, is really every day. It's really hard every day. But the more I read and the more I inform myself, the more I think I'm able to relate to that system.
I hope everybody listening caught that. She said the more that she reads and studies, the more informed she becomes about racism, white supremacy. I have found that is consistent in the system of white supremacy, whether you're just being more attentive when you watch Inspector Gadget, Dr. Kevorkian's recommendation, being more attentive to any television that you're watching, being more attentive to what's happening around you, you will become more informed about racism, white supremacy. I think that's going to wrap up our morning edition. I will go and prep my notes and get ready for the afternoon program. Justice's email again, justice.asap@yahoo.com. Final comment either, Kim or back of the bus?
No, sir. Just replace white supremacy with justice.
I dig it. Kim, do you have anything before we get out of here?
Ditto.
Ditto. I'll actually add justices. I like hers. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. immediately, for sure. I need to make a request as well. Some of the folks on this call, we are rendezvousing to go and see an exhibit about racism, white supremacy. Mr. Back of the Bus, if you could bring your laptop, that would be appreciated. If you are not able to, we'll work it out. I asked Yellow Manny. He forgot. Life is hard.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be in this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into the program. Hope it was constructive. We'll be back 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Central, and 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Justice and Gus T Renegade, the context of white supremacy. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Thank you all, and we'll be back soon. Signing out.